It's 7:30 in the evening across India. I'm Tanvi Taneja. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll bring you all the day's big stories from across India and the world. With me today from Washington, D.C. is my colleague, Caroline Malone. Hi, Caroline.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and 4 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, warring Sudanese leaders give competing addresses at the UNGA, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping meets his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad in China. But first, the headlines.
Ukraine launches missile strike on Russia's Black Sea Navy headquarters in Crimea. One Russian military serviceman killed. China's President Xi Jinping offers to rebuild Syria in his rare meet with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in Huangzhou. Sudan's army chief appeals to the world to designate rival Rapid Support Forces as a terrorist organization, even as the RSF says it is ready for a ceasefire.
Sorry?
The RSF is fully prepared to declare a ceasefire throughout Sudan.
So, yeah, I'm not sure.
And G4 countries, India, Brazil, Japan and Germany call for expansion of the UN Security Council to make the body more representative and efficient. So up first, updates on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia has claimed that one military serviceman was killed after Ukraine launched a missile strike on the Russian Black Sea Navy headquarters in Sevastopol on Friday. The Russian ministry also informed that their air defenses have downed 5 missiles aimed at Sevastopol. Meanwhile, a Russian official informed that the firefighters were battling a blaze at the site. He also added that some roads have been closed and locals have been asked to avoid the area. Crimea, which Russia seized and annexed from Ukraine in 2014, has been a frequent target of Ukrainian attacks in the course of the ongoing war. DD India's Dasha Chernyshova has more from Moscow.
The Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that Ukraine attempted yet another attack against the locations in the Russian territories. We understand that at least 5 cruise missiles have been intercepted by the Russian air defenses over Crimea, over Sevastopol, but one, as we got the reports, has hit the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Navy. We understand that one serviceman of the Russian military has died as a result of this attack. The headquarters of this historic building has caught fire, and the firefighters were taking all the measures to extinguish this fire. But that's not the only attack against the Crimean Peninsula. Early in the day, drones have also attempted to attack the peninsula. We also have heard about another cruise missile being intercepted over Bakhchisarai. So certainly a lot of drone attacks attempted by the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as cruise missile attacks. And we understand that over the corresponding days that have been increasing in scale, the Russian officials have been repeatedly saying that those attacks are carried out with the Western supplied weapons against the territories inside Russia, and that is underlining the attempt of the Ukrainian armed forces to somehow compensate for what Moscow says the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive.
As the Russia-Ukraine war seems unrelenting, the United States of America has once again showed its unwavering support towards Ukraine by providing new aid. The US President Joe Biden called on the world leaders to support Ukraine, even though he is facing criticism from within the nation over the continued flow of monetary and military aid.
The US has announced a fresh military aid package worth around $325 million for Ukraine. The package includes arms and ammunition that will help Ukraine to withstand Russia in harsh winter conditions.
With the days beginning to turn colder, Russia hopes once more to use winter as a weapon against the people of Ukraine. But as I discussed with President Zelensky, the people of Ukraine are steeled for this struggle ahead, and the United States is going to continue to stand with you.
The new aid comes as the Ukrainian president visited Washington, stressing that the trip has yielded significant results.
здоров'я, дорогі українці, українки.
We are preparing to create a new defense ecosystem together with the United States to produce weapons to further reinforce freedom and the production of life together. This will yield global positive results.
ППО, артилерія, снаряди, інженерні засоби.
The United States, which has been a staunch supporter of Kyiv, has also reiterated its accusation that Putin is the sole reason for the entire conflict.
Russia alone stands in the way of peace. It could end this today. Instead, Russia is seeking more weapons from Iran and North Korea that would violate multiple UN Security Council resolutions that Moscow itself voted to put in place.
Being the largest military donor to Ukraine, the US is now facing criticism both inside and outside for approving more funding. NATO Secretary touched upon it, saying Ukraine's victory will make it easier for the US to deal with China.
So if the United States is concerned about China and wants to pivot towards Asia, then you have to ensure that Putin doesn't win in Ukraine. Because if Ukraine wins, then you will have the second biggest army in Europe, the Ukrainian army, battle-hardened on our side. We have a weakened Russian army, and we have also now Europe really stepping up for defense spending. That will make it easier for you to focus also on China and not only, or be less concerned about the situation in Europe.
Meanwhile, fresh attacks are being carried out by both the warring parties. Russian military has claimed to carry out early morning cluster strikes on Ukrainian military facilities and shot down 75 Ukrainian military drones on Thursday, while Ukraine has escalated their counter-offense operations in southeastern Ukrainian city of Melitopol and eastern city of Bakhmut.
Now, Ukraine has also started testing its ability to restart commerce in its shipping lane after the Black Sea grain deal was suspended. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister said that the second cargo vessel with grain departed from Ukraine's southwestern seaport Chornomorsk. The official said that the vessel, Aryoyat, left with Ukrainian wheat for Egypt. On to news from New York, where the 78th UN General Assembly session is underway. India's Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, has reached the United States for the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Jaishankar held a warm discussion with Quad colleagues to start his participation at the 78th UNGA in New York. India's Foreign Minister welcomed the new Japanese Foreign Minister, Yoko Kamikawa, to the meeting. The two leaders discussed defending the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific and delivering on Quad commitments. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, expressed his happiness to join fellow Quad foreign ministers from Australia, India, and Japan on the sidelines of the UNGA's 78th session. The Quad is vital to the shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and together they reaffirmed their commitment to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. DD India's Sally Patterson tells us more on the world leaders, specifically India's Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar's participation at the 78th UNGA.
The Indian Foreign Minister has arrived in New York. He'll be here for the next few days, and he's expected to meet with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. And so they're expected to discuss some of the pressing issues that India wants to put on the United Nations radar. And we're also expecting India to be hosting an event this weekend, particularly for countries from the global south, making sure that their interests and priorities are really brought to the forefront of conversations here, something that India and other nations have criticized the body for not doing enough about in the past. And again, that was a theme that we saw at the G20 just a few weeks ago in India, that concern for listening to the needs of the global south, particularly when we're looking at issues such as aid and climate change, which is having a disproportionate impact on those countries.
Now, the G4 nations India, Brazil, Japan and Germany have reiterated that expansion of the UN Security Council in both permanent and non-permanent categories is essential to make the body more representative, legitimate, effective and efficient. They underscored that multilateralism is under significant strain due to multiple and complex crises. Moreover, they concurred that the UN Security Council's inability to effectively and timely address contemporary global challenges reinforces the urgent need for its comprehensive reform so that it better reflects contemporary geopolitical realities of the day. Now, in more news from the 78th UN General Assembly session, the platform, the United Nations, we know, is critical in solving major global issues. And one such issue is the Sudan conflict. Now, the heads of Sudan's rival military factions gave competing addresses to the United Nations on Thursday. My colleague Caroline Malone is in Washington, D.C. She gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Let's go over to Caroline now.
Well, the leaders of the warring faction of Sudan gave competing addresses at the 78th session of the UNGA. While the chief of the Sudanese army spoke from the podium of the UN headquarters, the leader of Sudan's paramilitary spoke through a video message from an undisclosed location.
After over 5 months of bloody conflict in Sudan, the heads of Sudan's rival military factions gave competing addresses to the United Nations on Thursday. The leader of Sudanese army, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, addressing the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, called on the international community to designate the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces as a terrorist organization.
I would like to reiterate our demand to designate the Rapid Support Forces and their allied militias terrorist groups, for they have committed. Our demand to designate the Rapid Support Forces and their allied militias terrorist groups, for they have committed all sorts of crimes that gives ground for such designation. There is a need to firmly address their sponsors, those who have supported the killing, burning, raping, the forced displacement, the looting, stealing, torture, transfer of arms and drugs, bringing mercenaries or recruiting children. All such crimes that necessitates accountability and punishment.
Whereas the leader of Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, spoke in a video message from an undisclosed location. He claimed his forces were fully prepared for a ceasefire and political talks to end the conflict.
شاملة تؤدي إلى حل سياسي شامل وإقامة حكومة مدنية تقود البلاد نحو التحول الديمقراطي واستلام الحقيقي الدائم.
Conflict that erupted in mid-April from the capital Khartoum has been spreading to other parts, displacing over 5 million people. Further, the Sudanese army chief has now warned that the ongoing conflict is showing signs of spilling to other parts of the region as well. In New Delhi, Akshay Dongre, DD India.
Well, for more on this story, DD India's Patrick Oyet reports from Juba in South Sudan.
When you look at the countries that are surrounding Sudan, then you see what the Sudanese military leader is talking about. For example, when you see, for example, South Sudan, where I am, you find that this is a country that has been also marred in conflict. There are up to now still armed groups that are not part of the government and they are fighting the government. So those armed groups can easily ally with other armed groups in other countries like Sudan and cause problems. A ceasefire and a negotiated settlement is possible. That is from the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary, whereas the government troops, the Sudan armed forces, think that perhaps militarily it could defeat the Rapid Support Forces. That's why it is calling for designating them as groups that are really not really a conventional war group or a group that is can be really just bandits, groups that are causing chaos, they're killing people. But the real Well, the truth is that this group is pretty much well organized. It has a structure, it has the commanders, it has supporters, and it has some territories that it has also taken over and is controlling. So everybody in the region, in the IGAD region, in the East African region, thinks that the only way forward is a negotiated settlement. The challenge, however, with the negotiated settlement is that there are so many efforts, and these efforts are not coordinated. There is one effort known as the Neighbors of Sudan, which is being led by Egypt and Chad. There is another effort being led by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, a regional body where Sudan is a member. And then there's another one that has been led by the US and Saudi Arabia in Jeddah. So you see these parallel processes are going, and they don't speak with one voice, and that is why the parties in Sudan are finding it easy to get away with whatever they are doing. The only possible and viable solution that many people say here is actually to have a negotiated settlement, have a ceasefire, go for peace talk, and then share power. This is what many people think will resolve the Sudanese problem.
While the Chinese President Xi Jinping met with his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou on Friday in an aim to upgrade diplomatic ties. China has offered to help boost Syria's economy and counter domestic unrest, while advancing its strategic interests in a region where it's already aligned with Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Chinese president has said a forthcoming announcement of the elevation of Syria-China ties will be an important milestone in the history of bilateral relations. And the Chinese President Xi Jinping also met the Kuwait Crown Prince in Hangzhou on the sidelines of the Asian Games. The Crown Prince arrived on Thursday to attend the opening ceremony of the 19th Asian Games. Well, the ethnic Armenian leadership of breakaway Nagorno-Karabakh has said that there were no outcomes from talks with Azerbaijan on possible security guarantees in an amnesty that Baku is proposing. Azerbaijan mounted an offensive this week and declared it had restored sovereignty over Karabakh, whose ethnic Armenian population broke away in a war in the 1990s. According to an Azerbaijani presidential advisor, it hopes for an amnesty for Karabakh Armenian fighters who gave up their arms, although some have decided to continue their resistance. However, an agreement was reached between Baku and Stepanakert for a humanitarian convoy from Armenia, following which the first batch of food and medicines were delivered on Friday. 120,000 people in Nagorno-Karabakh have suffered from a severe shortage of supplies since late last year, when a blockade began of a road connecting the region to Armenia. Well, as representatives from Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan held their first round of talks, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said he wanted ethnic Armenians to remain in the region. In a government meeting, Pashinyan said he hopes that the people of Yerevan would accept them, but a resettlement drive would only happen if it becomes impossible for Karabakh Armenians to stay there. On Thursday, Pashinyan also assured the current ceasefire is largely holding.
Units of the Nagorno-Karabakh Defense Army remain in the places where they were at the time the truce was signed. The same applies to the Azerbaijani armed forces. According to our data, unfortunately, today an incident occurred in the vicinity of Stepanakert. But in general, the truce remains, although sometimes there are violations.
Meanwhile, there were thousands of upset Armenians on the streets for a second day, calling for the government to step down after Azerbaijan's victory in Nagorno-Karabakh. The protesters are blocking roads and waving flags in protest against the surrender of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. They are protesting against the Armenian Prime Minister and demanding his resignation. Well, moving on, the Detroit 3 automakers and the United Auto Workers Union on Friday entered the final hours to reach new labour agreements as the deadline is looming for the current strikes to expand to include more plants. US auto workers could extend strike action in the coming hours if substantial progress is not made in negotiations. The United Auto Workers Union has set a final deadline of 2 hours from now and threatened that thousands more workers could walk off the job. DD India's Nick Harper reports from Washington.
It was the third straight day of losses for the main US indices. Traders were reacting to the Federal Reserve's announcement from Wednesday that the US central bank will likely leave rates at a higher level for longer than initially expected. The 10-year Treasury yield rose to around 4.5%. That's its highest level in more than 15 years, and that was partly due to the weekly jobless claims numbers. Those showed that the labour market remained strong, which could back up the Fed's plan for more rate hikes to try and cool hiring and in turn slow down inflation. The data showed a sharp drop in people claiming unemployment benefits for the first time, which suggests a robust jobs market. So at the close, the Dow was down 1.1%, the S&P dropped 1.6%, and the Nasdaq fell even further, closing the day down 1.8%. It means all three are currently on track to post weekly losses of between 1 to 3%. Nick Harper in Washington, reporting for DD India.
Well, that's it from me here in Washington, D.C. Back to the studio.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for joining us here in New Delhi. Caroline Malone joining us from our bureau in Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global. Still to come on the show. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi compliments the tireless efforts of Team G20 at the summit venue Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi. And have you ever heard of fighter jets landing on a motorway? Well, in a world first, Lockheed Martin's F-35A fighter jets land on a motorway in Finland.
Turning crisis into opportunity, transforming ideas into action, stories of real change, tales of sustainable solution. This series is going to tell stories of such change makers. Watch Change Makers on DD India.
The Indian government has brought in 33% reservation for women in parliament. How significant do you think this move is?
It's a really significant move. The kinds of decisions that parliaments make begin to change and begin to become more responsive to the needs of women and girls.
Why are we depending on this template still?
There isn't equality yet. So I don't know whether you have this analogy in India, but we say it's not an equal playing field.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I'm Tanvi Taneja. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi interacted with officials involved in the G20 summit at the summit venue Bharat Mandapam today. The interaction saw participation of around 3,000 people who contributed to the success of the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi. Addressing the gathering, the Prime Minister noted that the successful G20 summit was possible because of the tireless efforts by the hard-working ground functionaries. Now let's take a look at other stories making news around the world. In a first in the world, a pair of F-35A Lockheed Martin fighter jets landed on a motorway during a Royal Norwegian Air Force military exercise in Tarvo in central Finland. The feat will now enable the jets to reduce vulnerable time on the ground in times of war. And Colombia's third biggest city, Cali, is battling with raging wildfires for more than 10 hours on Thursday. A video footage showed the fires flaring up on the hills of Altos de Menga in the north of the capital of the Valle del Cauca province. Meanwhile, the Cali Fire Brigade on Friday confirmed that the fire was under control. They added the risk of damage to homes had also been ruled out. So with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram at DD India Live. You can also find us online on YouTube. Just type there DD India. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from all of us here in New Delhi. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.